A small closed room of 3 by 4 meters, a 2-seater sofa, a small table, 2 small chairs for visitors, and a carpet. That's all. In one hand a gun, in the other a cyanide pill. Underground, the light bulbs flicker occasionally due to the impacts of Russian artillery on the surface. Sometimes the tremors are felt even at this depth. "Tomorrow many will curse my name," he had said to one of his confidants before that moment. But haven't they already done so while he is still alive? Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the Third Reich, is about to end his life. Beside him, the only person who has remained loyal and has decided to stay with him until the end, and for that, he has granted her the honor of becoming his wife. Everything has been prepared for the end. Without a doubt, it was not the end the German dictator expected when he came to power in 1933, or when he started World War II with the invasion of Poland in 1939. Join us and discover what the end of the German dictator was like and how his final hours were. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. Hitler arrives in Berlin. In the final days of World War II, Berlin became the stage for an unparalleled tragedy, where the dreams of the Nazi thousand-year Reich would ultimately fade away. On January 16, 1945, Adolf Hitler, leader of the Third Reich, arrived at the Führerbunker, seeking refuge from the relentless advance of Soviet troops. He was forced to abandon his headquarters on the Eastern Front before it fell into enemy hands. It was clear to him from the beginning that he would die in Berlin, as he did not wish to flee and hide for the remainder of his days, constantly evading capture. The German dictator was facing the reality of imminent defeat, and was not in his best state due to the physical and psychological deterioration that the last months of the war had inflicted upon him. As the Soviets inexorably advanced towards Berlin, Hitler clung to illusions of counterattacks with units on paper that were not possible. They were simply unrealizable. Thus, the Führerbunker and its walls became a denial of reality for the dictator himself, who turned those walls into his final resting place. Hitler's birthday. On April 20th, on the occasion of his birthday, he received some members of the Hitler Youth who were fighting in Berlin and decorated them with second-class iron crosses while weakly smiling and shuffling his feet. He was already quite physically deteriorated, and the boys could see how Hitler's left hand kept trembling, and the Führer hid it, resting it on his back. Those defenders of Berlin, mostly children between 12 and 16 years old, stood at attention as the dictator walked among them, murmuring that he wished his generals had the courage of those children. The Hitler Youth, boys between 12 and 16 years old who had been quickly trained, were part of the armed forces fighting in the streets of Berlin. Their small size and knowledge of the city's streets allowed them to sneak into enemy rear areas to destroy tanks with Panzerfausts, putting their lives in danger several times. This moment was the last time Hitler was filmed by the Ministry of Propaganda, but only part of those images would be used by Goebbels' men. Despite the imminent defeat and Hitler's grave illness, it was not to show the weakness of the dictator to the defenders of Berlin and the soldiers who were still dying on the front lines. On the same day, the Soviet Northern Army broke into the neighborhoods of Lichtenberg, Niederschönhausen, and Frohnau in the capital of the Reich. Soviet artillery attacked the city center for the first time, and it also marked the last Allied bombing over the skies of Berlin. The evacuation of the Reich ministries began. All senior officials left the city trying to escape the waves of Red Army soldiers that were inexorably approaching the capital of the Reich, Berlin, before it was finally surrounded. Left behind was a weakened, ailing, and depressed Hitler, a shadow of the triumphant dictator of previous years. The Berliners no longer remembered the heroic Führer who had conquered Poland or defeated France, the best and largest army in the world on paper in 1940. But their thoughts were focused on one thing: survival. Although Hitler was unable to see it at that moment, the end of World War II was only a matter of weeks, if not days. The Russians reached Berlin. On April 22, 1945, from the northeast, the Russians penetrated the neighborhoods of Buchholz, Blankenburg, Heinersdorf, Malchow, and Biesdorf. The Soviets also managed to reach the districts of Pankow, Weissensee, and Lichtenberg, where they began fighting against the city's defenders themselves. Berlin became the front line at that moment. Daily meetings were held in a small meeting room in the bunker, a room measuring 3 x 4 meters, poorly lit and poorly ventilated. So those present in that room constantly felt a suffocating sensation due to its unhealthy air. There was also humidity, which heightened the feeling of oppressive atmosphere, and even some walls of the bunker had been recently painted, with the smell of fresh paint lingering in the air. That was the environment in which the staff meetings took place as reports arrived that the Soviets continued their unstoppable advance towards the Chancellery, towards the Führerbunker, towards Hitler. And yet, despite all this, his decision to die in Berlin remained unshaken. Adolf Hitler did not heed the suggestions of the officers and did not give in. The front line must not fall, Berlin must not be surrounded. The city was the front line. German forces did not need to create a corridor for the evacuation of civilians, but to stabilize the front and defeat the Red Army, which with its claws was slowly but surely beginning to encircle the German capital. Once the German dictator made a decision, he always followed it tenaciously. He envisioned an attack by German units to break the Soviet encirclement. Everyone knew that the units Hitler referred to either did not exist or were so weakened that they did not represent a significant combat force for any large-scale operation. Plans to save Berlin were doomed to failure from the outset for a simple reason. There were not enough units, and the enemy outnumbered the Germans 10-1, besides being magnificently prepared with thousands of artillery pieces, tanks and planes. The Germans barely had armored vehicles with very little fuel, hardly any planes in the skies, and ammunition for the artillery was scarce. Hitler ordered all units around Berlin to come to the aid of the capital. Only 2 trucks with about 80 men from the Charlemagne division of the Waffen-SS answered Hitler's call. The betrayal of Hermann Göring. And so we come to April 23, 1945. The Russians took Frohnau and the district of Pankow. Russian troops conquered Frohnau and much of the Pankow district. Hitler assumed command of the forces defending Berlin at that moment and ordered General Wenck's 13th Army Corps to come to the aid of the capital. Göring sent a telegram to the Führerbunker to succeed Hitler, thinking that Berlin was already surrounded and that the dictator would not be able to respond to his message. If so, he would assume all power if Hitler did not respond within 24 hours. It was a coup d'etat. Göring was arrested and stripped of all his positions. Despite Hitler having showered Hermann Göring with privileges and responsibilities, even naming him his successor, Göring had stabbed him in the back. This greatly irritated Hitler, and at that moment, he began to see the shadow of betrayal in all members of his inner circle. It was a betrayal by one of the closest members of the dictator's power elite, a betrayal that no one expected. This only increased the pressure on him, and he began to sleep poorly. He was practically awake all the time. He could barely get a few naps, and the stress became practically constant. Only with some drugs prescribed by his doctors, which were hardly advisable due to his poor health, did he manage to find some peace and sleep. But upon waking up, constant news of Soviet attacks came again, and he began to be under constant stress, and anger would consume him when anyone questioned any of his orders. Hitler was on the verge of a panic attack due to the dire situation he faced. For now, all he could do was continue to remain in the Führerbunker leading the Berlin forces. The Germans hoped for a miracle that seemed unlikely to occur. The Encirclement Closes. On April 24th, the last opportunity for the German dictator to escape from Berlin ended as the city was definitively encircled by the Soviets. The Russians advanced to Zehlendorf, Tempelhof, and Neukölln. Red Army troops reached Potsdam and Brandenburg. For every German killed, 10 Russians died, but the price the Red Army paid in blood seemed to matter little to its commanders, because they had a blank check when it came to troops available to assault the city. The Red Army was willing to accept any cost in casualties to take Berlin. On April 26th, violent battles occurred in the streets of Zehlendorf, in the Tempelhof field, Charlottenburg, and at the Silesia and Görlitz stations. Near the Brandenburg Gate, a 2-seater plane carrying Luftwaffe Generaloberst von Greim and test pilot Hanna Reitsch, who was his lover at the time, landed. The Soviets opened fire on the plane, and a projectile hit the cockpit. The German officer was wounded in the leg, and the petite Reitsch had to take control of the plane, managing to land it just in time. The test pilot had little trouble doing so, even having to maneuver the controls from the back seat while von Greim tried to stop the bleeding caused by shrapnel in one of his limbs, as she was one of the best pilots in all of Germany. The reason for the couple's daring action was simple. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe general to come to the city for instructions, something that could easily have been done by telegram or radio. Von Grimm's fanaticism led him to respond to the German dictator's call without hesitation. Back in the Führerbunker, while being treated for his wounds, Hitler visited him and appointed him commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe in the infirmary due to Hermann Göring's betrayal. Heinrich Reich then asked the dictator to flee with them in their plane, but Hitler flatly refused. He had decided to die in Berlin, and nothing would change his mind. Shortly afterward, from the Führerbunker, Hitler repeatedly ordered the 9th and 12th Armies to break through the Soviet encirclement of Berlin. General Weidling is appointed commander of the defense of Berlin. An artillery officer, General Weidling, was accused of desertion that day, and his immediate dismissal was ordered, along with a sentence of execution by firing squad for cowardice without any kind of trial. Instead of allowing himself to be apprehended, he presented himself in the Führerbunker and requested a meeting with the German dictator to express his displeasure with that order, as his position was at the front lines of combat. His rear position had turned into the front against the Russians because the German army had retreated. Hitler received him since Weidling was a highly decorated hero, having been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. The general's speech was courageous and full of energy. Hitler looked him directly in the eyes and, after a few seconds of thought, appointed him the supreme commander of the defense of Berlin. Weidling bit his lip and murmured that he would have preferred to be shot, but as a Prussian soldier, he would try to comply with the dictator's orders, as he had sworn allegiance to Hitler in 1933, just like all soldiers of the German army, and for him the word honor was something that stood above all else, and if he had to die to fulfill his oath, he would. Hitler ordered him to leave as he was tired. His eyes were sunken, but he remained steadfast, speaking with his staff officers, repeatedly ordering the arrival of the Busse and Wenck armies in Berlin to break the encirclement and stabilize the front. Although the German dictator met with the staff officers, they did not argue with Hitler and refused to explain the true situation because their Führer did not want to hear the truth. On the contrary, he wanted to see his version of the war with rapid counterattacks, mobilizing ghost divisions existing only on paper, and also proposing maneuvers on the map that could not be carried out because the men of those units had long given their lives for Germany, and therefore were divisions so weak that they barely posed a threat to the Soviet forces that had already surrounded the Berlin capital. The few who protested, like Weidling, were branded defeatists, and their ideas were quickly dismissed. The rest of the officers felt the weight of their old oath of loyalty so heavily that it caused them terrible concern. The oath of loyalty to Hitler would ultimately lead them to death or the gallows, as happened in some cases. Others would opt for suicide days later. Hitler decides to end his life. Hitler mentioned suicide for the first time curiously on his birthday, April 20th, to some of his confidants when the situation seemed unbearable. Some, the majority, insisted he flee Berlin, while a few advised him to stay in Berlin until the bitter end. To create a legend, he couldn't die anywhere else. He had to die in Berlin like a character from Wagner's operas. That's how Adolf Hitler was supposed to go down in history if the Germans lost the war. On April 27th, the Russians penetrated the districts of Schöneberg and Kreuzberg and occupied Spandau. Leaving Charlottenburg behind their lines to the northeast and Tempelhof Field to the south, Soviet tanks reached the center of the capital. In the afternoon, the Reich Chancellery was constantly bombarded by Soviet artillery. The walls of the bunker began to tremble, and the echoes of war could now be heard even underground. This created an atmosphere of death and desperation within the bunker for all those who still inhabited its confines. Initially, it seemed like this might compel Adolf Hitler to leave the Führerbunker, but the opposite happened. This did not frighten Hitler. Instead, it strengthened his conviction to die there. The battle continued the next day, and fighting reached the streets of downtown Berlin. It was at this moment that fierce battles erupted in Potsdamer Platz and near the old Reichstag, Parliament. Desperate calls from the bunker to break the encirclement began. Heinrich Reich managed to escape from Berlin with her plane, carrying von Grimm, now promoted to Air Marshal, although his tenure would not be very long as he would soon fall into Allied hands. That same day, Hitler met with the Reich Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, and his secretary Bormann to discuss possible strategies for continuing the fight in Berlin. Nevertheless, the two men most loyal to Hitler did not debate the orders and duly noted the dictator's wishes. The reasons why both did not insist on Hitler leaving Berlin were quite different. Bormann, on one hand, desired power, and with Hitler's possible death, he could potentially be named his successor, while Goebbels was a committed National Socialist who was willing to go to any lengths to continue defending the Nazi cause and his Führer to the end. Such was his conviction that his wife and children were living with him in the Führerbunker. Occasionally, the children could be heard playing in the Führerbunker, the upper bunker, and a well-dressed woman, almost like a movie star, could be seen strolling among the grey walls of the bunkers. That woman was Magda Goebbels. While the propaganda minister did not try to influence Hitler to leave Berlin, his wife did. Hitler refused again, even though Magda even begged him several times in private, even kneeling. Hitler was determined to die in Berlin, and it seems the more they asked him to leave the city, the stronger his conviction became to end his life by his own hand. Meanwhile, the German 12th Army Corps managed to break through the encirclement and free a group of German troops in Potsdam. They also managed to link up with the 9th Army, but their advance towards Berlin was halted by the Soviets due to their tremendous superiority, both in material and manpower. The men of the 9th Army were tired, fatigued, and had lost many men, but requests for help and demands continued to pour in from Berlin. Hitler marries Eva Braun. On April 29, 1945, the encirclement tightened even more. The Chancellery began to be constantly bombarded by artillery. Russian tanks that broke through at Wilhelmsplatz were halted by the last German Königsteiger tanks less than 400 meters from the Chancellery. Children and the elderly fought to the death to defend their women from being raped by Soviet soldiers, something that was common with any woman who fell into their hands, even prisoners of war. That same day, at 1 a.m, Hitler married Eva Braun with the intervention of notary Walter Wagner. The witnesses to the union were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. Initially, this decision to marry the woman he had publicly scorned for so many years raised some doubts among his inner circle, but the Führer had his own reasons for it. Hitler used to ignore and laugh at Eva among his comrades. Many labeled Eva Braun as the unhappiest woman in Germany, and indeed, she had plenty of reasons to be. Despite that, Eva remained faithful and came to Berlin to be by his side for one simple reason: love. Eva Braun loved Adolf Hitler and had decided to stand by his side until the end. Despite Hitler's explicit orders to flee and not come to the capital, Eva showed up in Berlin to share Hitler's fate. Despite having the opportunity to escape, Eva chose to do the opposite. Hitler admired, respected, and rewarded one thing above all: loyalty. Eva remained faithful despite any circumstances, and that's why Hitler married Eva Braun. Hitler rewarded years of loyalty by giving Eva Braun his surname. Loyalty, the same loyalty that Speer, Göring, and Himmler, three of his most loyal collaborators, had not shown him in the last days of World War II, which undoubtedly influenced the German dictator's decision to end his life. Hitler was tired, and his brother-in-law Fegelein had paid with his life for his anger and helplessness. None of those traitors except Speer would survive much longer. Just an hour later, at 2 a.m, Hitler drafted his political and personal testament with his secretary Traudl Junge after celebrating his wedding with champagne. In his will, he named his successor, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Führer of Germany, and his secretary, Martin Bormann, he named head of the Nazi Party, the NSDAP. His testament was typed by his secretary in silence. That only meant that Hitler was already contemplating his imminent death, something that crossed the secretary's mind as the typewriter keys struck the blank pages. It was the beginning of the end, the death of Mussolini. At 5:30 in the morning, 3 couriers, 3 officers of the General Staff, fled from the Führerbunker with copies of Hitler's testament. Wilhelm Zander, Bormann's assistant to deliver it to Grand Admiral Dönitz, Willy Johannmeier, Hitler's commander and assistant to deliver it to General Schörner, and Heinz Lorenz, head of the press office for public dissemination. Hitler retired to his private quarters with Eva Braun. At 12 noon, Freytag von Loringhoven, Captain Bolt, and Colonel Weiss left the Chancellery after obtaining Hitler's permission to try to meet with Wenck and thus attempt to save their lives. Some of them would manage to escape the encirclement, while others would be captured by the Red Army. The clock struck 4 p.m. At that moment, Hitler poisoned his dog Blondie along with Dr. Hase. The 4 puppies of the dog that had been born just a few weeks earlier were also sacrificed. Hitler met shortly after with his secretaries and gave each of them a cyanide capsule while saying, "I regret not having a better gift." But while this was happening, the tightening of the German army's grip on the government district of Berlin was growing tighter and tighter. German soldiers, especially those of the Waffen-SS, fought tenaciously despite clear numerical and armament inferiority. At 9:12 p.m. that same day, General Weidling proposed attempting to break the encirclement and flee. Hitler rejected the proposal. At 10 p.m., Colonel von Below left the Führerbunker to try to deliver a message to Marshal Keitel after obtaining Hitler's approval. Just half an hour later, news reached the bunker that the Italian dictator Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, had been murdered and their bodies hung upside down at a gas station. This caused terrible horror in Adolf Hitler. It gave him the conviction that he would not meet the same fate and that his mortal remains would not be captured by the enemy. Rokus Misch, radio operator of the Führerbunker, sent a final telegram from Berlin asking the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, the OKH, about the whereabouts of the German troops that were supposed to liberate the capital. It was 11 p.m. Although the night had already covered the city with its cloak, the explosions continued to be heard, and the walls of the Führerbunker continued to reverberate incessantly. The death of Hitler. And finally, the night of April 30th, 1945 arrived, when the Soviets penetrated the governmental district of the Reich, occupying most of the Tiergarten, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Reichstag, where the Soviet flag would be raised at 2:25 p.m. that same day. At that moment, terrible battles began, where the Germans fought house by house, room by room. At 1 a.m., the news that Hitler did not want to hear was received. The OKW, Supreme Command of the German Army, responded to Hitler's telegram. German troops were unable to rescue Berlin. All was lost. Hitler immediately ordered a meeting with all members of the Führerbunker and all members of his staff who had not yet left. He bid farewell to everyone with a slight handshake and uttered a few brief words to each of them. That farewell was synonymous with Hitler's intention to commit suicide. At noon, there was a final meeting of the General Staff with Hitler, where he was informed of the truth. Berlin was completely besieged, and there was no way to escape. It was only a matter of days or hours before the Soviets reached the Führerbunker. A phone rang in the Reich Chancellery, specifically in its underground parking lot, where the dictator's fleet of vehicles was kept. It was 1 p.m., and the chief responsible for the vehicle fleet, Hitler's chauffeur, Erich Kempka, received the order to bring 200 liters of gasoline to the bunker and leave them in the Chancellery garden. He did so without fully understanding the reason, but as it was a direct order from Hitler, he did not question it. At 2 p.m., Hitler had his last silent meal in the company of his secretaries and his cook. He had a vegetable soup. Despite this being his last meal, Hitler remained faithful to his vegetarian diet. Just an hour later, Hitler and Eva bid farewell to the senior officials and secretaries still in the bunker. At 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, Hitler held a Walther pistol. He was alone in the anteroom of his room with Eva Braun. At that moment, Adolf Hitler prepared to end his life. Eva was already dead. She lay on a sofa with her head resting on its arm, poisoned. On the carpet was a second Walther pistol that had not been used. Hitler sat at a table. Behind him should have hung a portrait of Frederick the Great, but he had given it to his personal pilot, Hans Bauer. In front of him on a console was a photograph of his mother when she was young. Hitler put the barrel of the pistol in his mouth and fired. He slumped forward, knocking over a vase of flowers that struck Eva's body and soaked her dress with water, and then fell to the floor. Finally, the bodies of Eva and Hitler were incinerated. The last sentence his bodyguard heard before Hitler locked himself in the anteroom of his room to commit suicide was this:
"Tomorrow many will curse my name."
Goebbels calls for peace. A gunshot was heard inside the bunker. Many Third Reich personalities, including Goebbels and Bormann, were informed minutes later by Hitler's adjutant, Ling, that the dictator had died alongside Eva Hitler. Shortly thereafter, at 6:07 p.m., Bormann radioed Dönitz, informing him that Hitler had named him his political successor. At 7:20 p.m., Kempka and Ling returned to the bunker after attempting to dispose of all traces of Hitler and Eva with gasoline. At 11:30 p.m., Goebbels ordered to contact the Russians to try to reach a conditional peace. The next day, May 1st, 1945, was Germany's first day without Hitler, while fighting continued in Berlin in small, isolated groups. Except for those remaining in the bunker, the rest of Germany was unaware that the German dictator had committed suicide. At 1 a.m., General Krebs left the Führerbunker to meet with Russian General Zhukov and present Goebbels' peace conditions. It was requested that all government representatives present in the Führerbunker be allowed to flee, and in return, Germany would lay down its arms. The meeting with the Russians took place 3 hours later. Krebs met with the Russian general and handed him Goebbels' proposal in writing, as well as a report from Bormann informing of the Führer's death. In the morning, General Krebs returned to the Führerbunker and commented that the Russians would only accept unconditional surrender. At 2:16 p.m., Goebbels and Bormann radioed Dönitz. The Führer died yesterday at 3:30 p.m. In his will of the 29th, he entrusts you with the position of President of the Reich. At 4:30 p.m., most of the refugees in the Führerbunker prepared to flee, hoping to break the siege. The idea was to use several armored vehicles and soldiers still around the Chancellery fighting to create a gap in the Soviet lines. At 8:30 p.m., Goebbels and his wife committed suicide. Their secretary finished them off. Their bodies were incinerated with the leftover gasoline from the cremation of Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies, although they were not completely incinerated. Before committing suicide, the Goebbels couple ended the lives of their children by forcing them to ingest cyanide capsules. 2 hours before midnight, the evacuation of the 400 people who had remained in the Chancellery bunker under the command of Munker, an SS Waffen officer who had been appointed commander of the garrison protecting the government sector of Berlin, began. In that group were Axmann, the leader of the Hitler Youth, Bormann, Hitler's secretary, Kempka, Hitler's personal driver, and Stumpfegger, an SS Waffen doctor and one of Adolf Hitler's personal physicians. Generals Bergdorf and Krebs committed suicide in the bunker, and their bodies would be discovered shortly thereafter by the first Russian soldiers to penetrate the bunker shortly thereafter. At 10:26 p.m., Radio Hamburg announced the following: from the Führer's headquarters, Adolf Hitler, fighting to the last moment against Bolshevism from his command post in the Chancellery, has died for Germany. The next day, May 2nd, General Weidling, military commander of Berlin, surrendered. He would be responsible for announcing Germany's surrender over the radio. Just as he broadcast the message, he suffered a heart attack. Despite orders for troops in Berlin to lay down their arms, fighting ended on May 8th in some sectors of the city. There were hundreds of suicides, especially among high-ranking officers and Waffen-SS officers. The end of World War II in Europe. And so it was that the war ended in Europe shortly thereafter, and although the German forces surrendered in Berlin, fighting continued for a few more days because Hitler's successor, Grand Admiral Dönitz, ordered the fight to continue in the east so that other units and civilians could escape to the west and be captured by the Allies instead of by the Red Army. The fate of those who escaped from the bunker varied greatly, and even today the destiny of many of them is questioned. The cannons fell silent in Europe, but the war would continue on the Pacific Front until August 1945.